Hello everyone, and welcome to The Bias Report for the week of June 3rd, 2019. I'm your host Paul, here with you as always to bring you the week in biased news. I've got another good show lined up for you, with stories ranging from renegade vacuum cleaners to, you guessed it, President Donald Trump being incredibly polarizing. Imagine that. After that, in our main story, I've decided to change things up a little bit from the previous episodes. Let's just say that if you think biased media is an issue here in the United States, you ain't seen nothing yet. Apparently, there's this whole other country out there outside of the land of the free that has clearly been listening to my podcast and decided to take it to a whole other level. Want a hint? It's China. I guess that wasn't really a hint. Anyway, we'll get into that in a bit. But first, the first segment of the show, the Weekly Rundown. Be right back. And we're back. So here's my first segment of the show, the Weekly Rundown. This is where I take news headlines from the week from the left, right, and wherever else on the political spectrum, and see what they can tell me with exactly zero context. So, out of these headlines, I do no fact-checking and read none of the article. I just want to discover the world, so to speak, through the worldview of the publication that wrote it, and then use that to reinforce my pre-existing beliefs, if I were a reader of it. This week, we'll start on the right. From the National Review. The Mueller investigation was always an impeachment probe. I knew it. The whole damn thing was just a probe to try and attack our poor old commander-in-chief. Even worse, Mueller had to go and drag that choir boy Vladimir through the mud too. Shameless, I tell you. Up next, from Free Beacon. The Obama curse strikes again. Warriors lose 2 starters to injury. Raptors blow halftime lead as former POTUS looks on. Thank God that dude's gone. Just cursing things left and right. Just like his entire administration, am I right? The worst thing is he just sat there looking on after cursing the NBA Finals. Up next, from American Thinker. Two-faced Pete Buttigieg expresses solidarity with striking Uber drivers, but will attend fundraiser sponsored by Uber exec. Uh-oh, guys. Flip-flop alert. A politician saying one thing and doing another entirely? That's completely unheard of, right? Our current beloved president would never be caught in bed with corporate interests. That's for sure. Up next, also from American Thinker. Impeachment fever. Democrats whip themselves into a frenzy. Just like last week, another frenzy. Those Dems are just loose cannons, throwing their weight around in a fever. It's a witch hunt, I tell ya. Up next from The Blaze. Piers Morgan blasts disrespectful British anti-Trump protesters. When we needed the Americans in World War II, they were there for us. Yeah, okay, so let me get this straight. Since the U.S. helped them out against the ultimate evil empire of history 75 years ago, all of their people should automatically respect our elected officials now. Totally valid point there, Piers. Up next from Fox News. Xi discovers that president is not putty in his hands. Xi here is referring to Xi Jinping, the president, I think, of China. And I'm sure that the Chinese media agrees. Whoa, that American guy is not putty, regardless of what that belly looks like under his suit. That wraps up the conservative side of the aisle for this week. On to the left. From CNN. Analysis. Trump already has an excuse ready if he loses in 2020. Once again, the left is getting ahead of themselves. There were plenty of articles like this in the run-up to the 2016 election. Oh, he'll lose all right, but what if he doesn't accept it? Maybe you guys should worry about beating him first. From CNN. Late Night roasts Trump's denial of UK protests. Okay, cool. This is really front-page news? That's what their job is, right, comedians? To have fun with politicians? Up next, from MSNBC. Trump says thousands greeted him in London. They were really protesting him. Oh, Trump. So detached, delusional, and probably intellectually inept that he really thinks they were supporters? What a stooge. Good on you, MSNBC, for laying out the truth for us. Journalism at its finest. Next from Alternet. Why is the media ignoring Rand Paul's disastrous and extreme plan to gut the federal government? Oh no, he wants to get rid of bureaucracy and government overspending? Why isn't the media covering this? He's a monster. The funny thing is, a conservative site would probably frame this in the completely opposite way. Instead of gut the federal government, it would be drain the swamp. Up next, also from Alternet. Corporations paid $91 billion less in taxes under GOP tax code overhaul. Report. Corporations are the true evil. The government is the good guy. They'll stop them. If only the orange man and his cronies would step out of the way. I'm not trying to say that corporations are not evil. It's just funny that left-leaning media goes after big corporations while the right goes after big government. So formulaic. So that wraps up the liberal and conservative points of view this week. On to the other category. Huffington Post. Louisiana cops. Don't call us to complain about Taco Bell. Listen up, Bayou Brigade. I'll call you whether you want me to or not. No fire sauce left? 911. Refuse to serve me an AM Crunchwrap Supreme in the PM? 911. Just because it's not a crime shouldn't mean that I can't call my trivial complaints to an emergency service, right? Up next from Huffington Post. Air Force officials say penis-shaped contrails were unintentional. Cue the X-Files theme song. Sure, they were unintentional, Air Force. That's just what they would want me to think. Open your eyes, people. That dick in the sky is really the wool pulled over your eyes. Up next from UPI.com. Doctor finds spider nesting inside patient's ear. Thanks, UPI. Thanks a lot. You're clearly biased against any part of my brain that isn't completely horrified by this title. It's okay, I didn't enjoy sleeping at night anyway. Next from NPR. Senator Elizabeth Warren has a plan for everything, including your love life. Great. The Dems want to control my love life, too. Figures it was only a matter of time. It makes sense that these liberals want to meddle in everything. Well, I say MTGA. Make Tinder great again. And finally from NPR. Oregon man called police about a burglar. Armed officers found a rogue Roomba. The media would have you think that this is just a cutesy story about a guy afraid of his vacuum. But if you ask me, it's just the first sign of the robots taking over. First Roombas, then our jobs, and then the world. All right, guys, that does it for this week's rundown. I'll be right back with the week's main story. And welcome back to the main story. So this week I decided to change things up a little. So far with this show, my main stories have been focused on political biases in the American media. It's a topic that will, it seems, never stop providing me with new source material. At least not at this pace. But I think that bias is a worldwide issue. And that can go much further than just bias. It can become outright censorship if left unchecked. And while it's truly frustrating to see the right and left quibble against each other and divide the public apart here in the States, it's easy to forget that we've still actually got it pretty good here. Some parts of the world are not so lucky. Some places like the land of stolen patents and exploitative manufacturing. China. Or Jaina, if you're Donald Trump. So if you didn't know, this past Tuesday, June 4th, was the 30th anniversary of the massacre at Tiananmen Square, perpetrated by the Chinese government on its own people. If all you're aware of from this story is a picture of a guy standing in front of a tank, here's a little background. In April of 1989, large-scale protests began at the famous Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Comprised mostly of students, the protesters were demanding, among other things, democracy, freedom from censorship, and the end of restrictions on demonstrations in Beijing. These are all things that we in the West, particularly in the U.S., hold pretty highly. Actually, it's covered in our Bill of Rights, so we should all be sympathetic to these protesters, in my opinion. These protests escalated through the end of April and through May, receiving more and more attention from the worldwide media. There were hunger strikes. All of this only helped to embarrass the Chinese government when the protesters refused to leave the square during a visit by Mikhail Gorbachev from the USSR, which was a historical moment for the Chinese government. On top of this, protests were beginning to spread outside of Beijing to nearly 400 cities in China. Things continued to spiral out of control in both the government and within the protesters themselves. Eventually, hardliners in the Communist Party and the Chinese government invoked martial law in Beijing. On June 4th, the military cleared the square by, quote, any means necessary. Things got very dirty. When all was said and done, hundreds, some say thousands, depending on who you ask, were dead at the hands of the Chinese government. This, by all accounts, is an absolute tragedy. It is something that must be remembered by the world, but most importantly, by the Chinese people themselves. So I decided to see what the two sides, the Chinese and everyone else, had to say about this story. So I started with the Western world. According to The Independent, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made statements this week calling on China to essentially own up to the event and make a public accounting of the dead and missing people from the massacre, which there are still no official records for. The official Chinese response made a Donald Trump tweet storm seem thought out and well-measured. From an official in the Chinese government, these lunatic ravings and babbling nonsense will only end up in the trash can of history. And Mr. Pompeo denigrates the state of China's human rights and religious affairs, wantonly criticized China's Xinjiang policy, and severely interferes in China's domestic affairs. Damn, China. Maybe lay off the coffee a little bit. According to the AP News, several of the activists they were in contact with could suspiciously not be reached by phone or text this week. They were on a, quote, vacation in the north of the country. Chinese nationals living overseas reported that they were blocked from posting on Weibo, a Chinese social networking site. In the U.S., our problem is that literally everyone has access to their phones, probably too much. It's like wading through a swamp of half-thought-out ideas and screaming. Whereas in China, it seems that if you speak your opinion too much, you don't get to have an opinion anymore. In keeping with my main story format, I decided to get the Chinese take on the story as well. I went to Xinhua, the official Chinese state news site, and, believe it or not, couldn't find a single thing about Tiananmen Square. I typed it in their site's search bar, and was only returned stories from months ago about the square being fancied up for some upcoming event. So, in other words, that would be radio silence from the Chinese side of the aisle. I could literally not find a single thing. Well, that makes my job easy, I guess. Nothing to critique or dissect. Just nothing. So I guess that what I learned this week was that no matter how annoying all the different biases and opinions here in the U.S. are, at least we get to have biases and opinions. Things could be a whole lot worse. That about wraps it up for this week. I'll be back next Friday with another brand new episode of The Bias Report. Remember, if you like the show, please subscribe. If you have any friends or family that might enjoy it, they can find me on Facebook at The Bias Report, Twitter at bias_report, or my site, thebiasreport.com. Until next week, think about what you read and don't pay too much attention to the news. That's my advice. So long.